Every living creature deserves someone to hear their cry for help. Sometimes the smallest voice can change the hardest heart forever. In the dusty trails of the Old West, weathered cowboy Jake Morrison rides home from a brutal cattle drive that cost him everything he held dear. His heart carries wounds deeper than any frontier doctor could heal. When faint whimpers reach his ears from beneath a pile of weathered wood and debris, Jake almost keeps riding. He's learned that caring leads to losing, and losing leads to pain he can't bear again. But something in those desperate cries stops him cold. Hidden beneath the rubble, a tiny puppy fights for life with the same stubborn determination Jake once knew. What Jake doesn't realize is that saving this small creature will set in motion a chain of events that will heal his broken spirit and give him a family he never expected to find. But will Jake's enemies from his past allow him this second chance at happiness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over the Montana Territory, painting the endless grasslands in shades of amber and rust. Jake Morrison's weathered hands gripped the reins of his bay mare, Sage, as they crested the familiar hill overlooking his modest ranch. 3 years had passed since he'd claimed this patch of land, but it still felt more like a place to exist than a home to cherish. The ranch house stood simple and sturdy against the vast sky, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney sending lazy smoke into the evening air. A small barn sheltered his remaining cattle, maybe 30 head that represented what was left of his dreams. The corral fence needed mending, and the vegetable garden had surrendered to weeds weeks ago. These were the details of a man who worked to survive, not to build something beautiful. Jake dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after weeks in the saddle. At 42, he carried himself like a man who had seen too much and lost more. His dark hair, streaked with premature silver, fell across eyes that had once sparkled with laughter, but now held the steady watchfulness of someone who expected disappointment. His face, carved by sun and wind, bore the kind of lines that spoke of squinting against harsh weather and harder memories. He unsaddled Sage with the mechanical precision of long habit, his movements efficient but joyless. The mare nickered softly, nuzzling his shoulder in a gesture of affection that Jake acknowledged with a brief pat. Animals, he'd learned, were easier than people. They asked for food and shelter and gave loyalty in return. No complicated emotions, no promises they couldn't keep. The routine of evening chores provided a familiar rhythm. Feed the cattle, check the water troughs, secure the barn for the night. Each task completed with the same methodical care he'd shown during his years as a lawman, back when attention to detail meant the difference between coming home safe and leaving a widow to mourn. Those days felt like another lifetime now, buried beneath years of solitude and the kind of grief that settled into a man's bones like winter cold. As darkness claimed the valley, Jake lit the oil lamp in his kitchen and prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. The silence inside the house pressed against him like a living thing. He'd grown accustomed to it, even found comfort in its predictability. But sometimes the quiet reminded him of other evenings when this space had been filled with gentle conversation and a child's laughter. In the bedroom, hidden beneath a stack of old newspapers, lay a small wooden cross he'd carved 3 years ago. His hands had trembled as he worked the pine, each cut of the knife releasing the scent of fresh wood and fresh pain. The cross bore no name, no dates, just the simple symbol of faith he'd lost the day he'd buried his 6-year-old daughter. Emma and his wife Sarah, victims of the fever that swept through their previous town like a prairie fire. Doc Henderson had done everything he could. Jake remembered the old physician's gentle hands and sorrowful eyes as he delivered the news that would shatter Jake's world. Sarah first, then Emma 2 days later, both taken despite Jake's desperate prayers and promises to a God who seemed to have turned his face away. The cross remained hidden because Jake couldn't bear to place it at their graves, couldn't bear the finality of that gesture, and couldn't bear to throw it away. The town of Millfield, 8 miles east of his ranch, provided Jake with the minimal human contact his survival required. Sheriff Tom Williams, a good man nearing retirement, occasionally rode out to check on him. They'd served together years ago in Kansas, before Jake gave up his badge to try ranching with Sarah. Tom understood the weight of loss and the value of respectful silence. Doc Henderson, now in his 60s, ran the town's only medical practice, from a small building that also served as the barbershop on Tuesdays. His steady hands had delivered half the children in the county and closed the eyes of their grandparents. He possessed the rare gift of knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the healing. Doc had attended Sarah and Emma in their final days, and Jake respected him for the gentleness he'd shown during those dark hours. Martha Colson owned the Sunrise Saloon, though saloon overstated the establishment's ambitions. She served decent meals, poured honest whiskey, and maintained the kind of no-nonsense atmosphere that attracted working men rather than troublemakers. Martha, a widow herself, understood the particular loneliness of losing a spouse. She'd lost her husband to consumption 2 years prior and kept his favorite chair empty at the bar, not from sentiment, but from the practical understanding that some absences require acknowledgement. The general store belonged to Pete Hawkins, a nervous man who'd moved west seeking adventure, but discovered he preferred the safety of inventory and accounting. Pete stocked Jake's supplies without judgment, accepting payment in cattle or labor when cash ran short. He asked few questions and offered fewer opinions, traits Jake valued in their business relationship. These people formed the loose community that surrounded Jake's isolation without intruding upon it. They recognized him as a man who needed distance but not abandonment, space but not exile. Their quiet acceptance allowed him to function without forcing him to heal faster than his wounded spirit could manage. Jake's days followed patterns worn smooth by repetition. Morning coffee as the sun painted the eastern peaks. Check the cattle, mend what needed mending, tend to the endless small tasks that kept a ranch operational. Afternoon rides to check his boundary lines and water sources. Evenings spent reading old newspapers by lamplight, avoiding the books Sarah had loved because her laughter still echoed in certain passages. The cattle drive he'd just completed had been his most ambitious venture since settling here. 30 head driven to the railroad town of Cedar Falls, 2 weeks of hard travel that netted him enough money to last through winter if he lived carefully. But the journey had stirred memories he preferred to leave settled. Other cowboys around. The evening fires had talked about their families, their hopes, their plans to build something lasting. Their words had reopened wounds Jake thought had finally scarred over. Sleep came reluctantly in the small hours, often interrupted by dreams that blended past happiness with present emptiness. He'd wake to find tears on his pillow and spend the remaining darkness hours staring at the ceiling, wondering if the pain would ever truly fade, or if he was destined to carry it like a stone in his chest for whatever years remained to him. The morning after his return from Cedar Falls, Jake rose, before dawn out of habit rather than necessity. The routine of coffee and breakfast passed in familiar silence until he heard something that stopped him mid-sip. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind through the pine trees or the creek running high from recent rains. But as he stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug warming his hands against the morning chill, the sound came again, weak but unmistakably desperate. Something small and hurt was calling for help, and despite everything Jake had learned about the dangers of caring, something deep in his chest answered that call. The cries led Jake down the slope behind his barn, toward the creek bed, where winter runoff had carved deep channels through the red earth. His boots crunched on pine needles and scattered pebbles as he followed the sound, pausing every few steps to listen and adjust his direction. Whatever was making that noise was small and growing weaker. Near the old wagon trail that connected his ranch to the main road, Jake discovered the source of the desperate calls. A freight wagon had overturned sometime recently, probably during the spring thaw, when the ground turned treacherous with mud and standing water. The wooden sides had collapsed inward, creating a pile of weathered planks, canvas, and scattered supplies that someone had apparently decided wasn't worth salvaging. The whimpering came from beneath the wreckage. Jake approached carefully, mindful that injured animals could react unpredictably even when seeking help. He began moving planks aside, working methodically to avoid causing further collapse. The wood was heavy with absorbed moisture, and some pieces had been there long enough for moss to claim their surfaces. As he cleared away the debris, the cries grew stronger, more urgent. Finally, Jake lifted a section of canvas and found himself staring into a pair of bright brown eyes that held more determination than he'd seen in his own mirror for years. The puppy was tiny, maybe 8 weeks old, with fur that might have been golden before mud, and fear had darkened it to brown. One back leg lay at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and the little creature's breathing came in quick, shallow pants that spoke of pain and exhaustion. But those eyes, they fixed on Jake with an intensity that demanded acknowledgement, demanded action, demanded that this moment matter. "Well now," Jake murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. "Look what we've got here." The puppy tried to crawl toward him, dragging the injured leg and whimpering with each movement. The sound cut through Jake's chest like a blade, stirring emotions he'd spent 3 years learning to suppress. He recognized the look in those small eyes because he'd seen it in his own reflection during the darkest nights after losing Sarah and Emma, the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to help. Jake reached toward the puppy slowly, letting the small creature smell his hand before attempting contact. The puppy's tongue, pink and warm, brushed across his fingers in a gesture of trust that nearly broke Jake's composure. When was the last time any living thing had reached toward him instead of away? "Easy there, little one," he said softly. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Examining the injuries required gentle handling and careful positioning. The broken leg needed immediate attention, but Jake could see scrapes and bruises along the puppy's ribs and haunches where debris had fallen. The little animal had been trapped here for at least a day, maybe longer, surviving on determination alone. As Jake considered his options, a familiar voice in his mind warned him away. This was exactly how pain began, with caring about something, small and helpless. Better to walk away, let nature take its course, avoid the inevitable heartbreak that came with attachment. He'd learned that lesson at the highest possible cost, but the puppy's breathing grew more labored as Jake hesitated, and those brown eyes never left his face. The little creature seemed to understand that this moment would determine everything, that Jake held the power of life and death in his weathered hands. "Damn," Jake whispered, the word carrying the weight of a man who recognized his own defeat. He needed something to carry the puppy safely without causing additional injury to the broken leg. His work shirt, though worn thin in places, would serve as a makeshift sling. Jake stripped it off and laid it flat on the ground, then carefully lifted the puppy onto the fabric. The little animal whimpered but didn't struggle, as if understanding that cooperation meant survival. Creating the sling required a delicate balance between security and accessibility. Jake tied opposite corners together to form a carrying pouch, then fashioned longer strips from the sleeves to create straps he could wear across his shoulders. The design would keep the puppy immobilized while allowing Jake to use his hands for climbing and navigation. As he settled the improvised carrier against his chest, Jake felt the puppy's rapid heartbeat against his bare skin. The rhythm spoke of fear and pain, but also of stubborn life refusing to surrender. The warmth was oddly comforting, a reminder of what it felt like to be needed by something innocent and trusting. The walk back to his ranch tested both Jake's resolve and his engineering. The puppy's weight, negligible as it was, seemed to grow heavier with each step as Jake became more aware of the responsibility he'd accepted. Every movement required consideration of how it might affect the injured animal nestled against his chest. By the time they reached the ranch house, Jake had made several decisions that surprised him. First, he would take the puppy to Doc Henderson in town, regardless of the cost. Second, he would provide whatever care the animal required during recovery. Third, and most unsettling, he would allow himself to hope that his efforts might make a difference. Inside the house, Jake created a temporary bed from old blankets near the fireplace where gentle warmth might help combat shock. He settled the puppy carefully, noting how the small creature immediately curled into the softest corner of the makeshift nest. The brown eyes followed Jake's movements with watchful intelligence. "I'll be back," Jake promised, though he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to make the commitment aloud. Doc Henderson will know what to do. As he harnessed Sage for the ride to town, Jake caught himself moving with more urgency than he'd felt in years. The puppy's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. Yet something about the situation demanded swift action. Perhaps it was the recognition that this small creature had fought so hard to survive that giving up now would be a betrayal of that courage. The ride to Millfield typically took Jake over an hour at an easy pace, but today he pushed Sage harder than usual, the makeshift sling cradled carefully in his arms. The puppy had grown quiet, either from exhaustion or the motion of the horse, and Jake found himself checking frequently to ensure the small chest still rose and fell with breathing. Doc Henderson was sweeping his front steps when Jake arrived, and the old physician's expression shifted from casual greeting to professional concern as he noticed Jake's urgency and unusual cargo. "What have we got here?" Doc asked, setting aside his broom and gesturing toward his office door. "Found him trapped under an overturned wagon," Jake explained, following Doc inside. "Legs broken, been there at least a day." Doc's examining table, designed for human patients, was too high for the puppy's comfort, so they improvised with a low bench covered in clean towels. As Jake carefully transferred his small charge from the sling to the makeshift examination area, he realized his hands were trembling slightly. "Well, aren't you a fighter?" Doc murmured to the puppy, his voice taking on the gentle tone he'd used with Emma during her final illness. "Let's see what we can do to help." The examination confirmed Jake's assessment while revealing additional concerns. The broken leg was a clean break that would heal with proper setting and rest. More worrying were signs of dehydration and the possibility of internal injuries from the debris collapse. "He'll need careful tending for the next several days," Docky explained as he prepared a small splint. "Regular feeding, warm shelter, and someone to watch for complications. You planning to take on that responsibility, Jake?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications both men understood. Caring for the puppy meant accepting the risk of loss, opening his heart to the possibility of pain, choosing hope over the safety of emotional distance. Jake looked down at the small creature on the bench, noting how the puppy's breathing had steadied during Doc's gentle examination, how those brown eyes still held their determined spark, despite the trauma. "Yeah," Jake said quietly, "I reckon I am." Doc Henderson's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he set the puppy's broken leg, the small animal remaining remarkably still throughout the procedure. Jake watched from nearby, surprised by how intently he followed every detail of the treatment, as if memorizing the process might somehow ensure its success. "The bones aligned properly," Doc explained, wrapping the tiny limb in strips of clean cotton. "Young animals heal quickly if they get proper rest and nutrition. This little fellow's got the advantage of youth and apparently unlimited determination." He reached for a small brown bottle from his medical supplies and measured out a few drops of liquid onto a teaspoon. The puppy accepted the medicine without struggle, though his small face wrinkled at the taste. "Willow bark extract," Doc said, handing Jake the bottle. "Helps with pain and reduces swelling. 3 drops twice daily until the bottle's empty. Mix it with a little water or milk if you have it." Jake accepted the bottle with the solemnity of a man receiving sacred instructions. The glass felt warm, in his palm, and the cork stopper bore the sweet, earthy scent of the medicine inside. Such a small thing to hold so much hope for healing. He'll need to eat frequently, but in small portions, Doc continued, gathering supplies into a cloth bundle. Warm milk, soft bread soaked in broth, maybe some scrambled eggs. His stomach's been empty too long to handle much at once. The instructions created an immediate problem Jake hadn't considered. His bachelor existence required minimal cooking skills and even less variety in ingredients. His pantry held coffee, beans, flour, salt pork, and little else that might appeal. To a recovering puppy, "Martha keeps chickens behind the saloon," Doc suggested, reading Jake's expression. "She might spare some eggs and milk. Tell her it's for a medical patient." The ride home passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the puppy's occasional soft whimpers from the sling. Jake found himself adjusting his posture to provide the smoothest possible journey, a consideration that would have amused him under different circumstances. When had he last worried about anyone's comfort but his own? Back at the ranch, Jake settled the puppy in the blanket nest by the fireplace before making his first attempt at invalid cookery. The process of warming milk without scalding it required more attention than he'd expected, and his first batch of soft scrambled eggs turned out rather more scrambled than soft. But the puppy ate eagerly, his small pink tongue working methodically to clean the shallow dish Jake had improvised from a saucer. "Guess you're not particular about cooking quality," Jake observed, settling cross-legged beside the nest to monitor the feeding. The puppy paused in his eating to look up at Jake, tail attempting a weak wag despite the splintered leg. The first night proved challenging for both of them. Jake moved his bedroll to the floor near the fireplace, telling himself he needed to monitor the patient's condition. In reality, he discovered he couldn't bear the thought of the small creature suffering alone in the darkness. Every whimper or restless movement sent Jake instantly alert, checking for signs of distress or complication. By morning, both man and puppy showed signs of fatigue, but the little animal's appetite remained strong, and his eyes held increasing alertness. Jake administered the morning dose of willow bark extract, pleased when the puppy accepted the medicine with less resistance than the day before. Establishing a routine became essential for both their sakes. Morning medicine followed by breakfast, brief periods of gentle handling to check the splint and assess healing progress, midday feeding and water, afternoon rest while Jake attended to ranch chores, always within earshot of the house, evening, meal, and medicine. Bedtime stories, though Jake told himself he was simply thinking aloud about his plans for the next day. The stories began accidentally on the third evening, when Jake found himself explaining his ranch's layout to the puppy, while changing the bedding in the nest. "See, the creek runs down from that ridge to the north," he said, pointing toward the window, though darkness had long since claimed the landscape. "Good water year-round, which is why I chose this spot. Sarah always said water was more valuable than gold in this country." The puppy's head tilted at the mention of Sarah's name, and Jake realized he'd spoken his wife's name aloud for the first time since her funeral. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight Jake hadn't expected. She would have liked. "You," he continued, surprising himself with the admission, "had a soft spot for creatures that needed tending. Used to take in injured birds, stray cats, anything that wandered onto our property, looking lost." As the days passed, Jake developed an awareness of the puppy's moods and needs that surprised him with its precision. He could distinguish between whimpers of pain and sounds of boredom or loneliness. He learned to gauge appetite and energy levels from the way the small animal positioned himself in the nest. Most unsettling, he began to anticipate the puppy's requirements before they were expressed. The splintered leg showed encouraging signs of healing, though Doc Henderson's warnings about the importance of rest proved prescient. The puppy's natural energy began returning as pain decreased, creating challenges in keeping him properly immobilized. Jake found himself constructing barriers around the nest to discourage exploration, while providing enough space for limited movement. Martha Colson proved generous with eggs and milk, accepting Jake's money with the practical grace of a businesswoman who understood both necessity and pride. She asked no questions about his unusual purchases, though Jake caught her glancing toward the cloth bundle where he carried supplies back to his horse. Animals got a way of teaching us things we didn't. No, we needed to learn, she commented during one such transaction, her tone carefully neutral. Sometimes the teaching's harder than the learning. Jake considered her words during the ride home, recognizing their truth without fully accepting their implications. The puppy was teaching him things, certainly. Patience, gentleness, the forgotten rhythm of caring for something beyond his own immediate needs. But these lessons came with risks he wasn't sure he was prepared to accept. The most dangerous moments came in the evening quiet, when the puppy would rest his small head against Jake's leg and simply breathe contentedly in the warmth of the fire. During these times, Jake felt something shifting inside his chest, a gradual thawing of ice he'd packed around his heart 3 years ago. The sensation was both welcome and terrifying. At night, alone with his thoughts, while the puppy slept peacefully. In the nest, Jake wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. What would happen when the leg healed and the small animal no longer needed constant care? Could Jake release him to find his own way, or had they already crossed some invisible line that made separation impossible? The brown medicine bottle on his mantelpiece caught the firelight each evening, a reminder of the commitment he'd made and the hope he'd chosen to embrace. 3 drops, twice daily. Such simple instructions for such complicated healing. The puppy's recovery progressed steadily through the second week, marked by increasing alertness and a determined effort to explore beyond the confines of his nest. Jake found himself engaged in a constant, gentle battle to keep the small animal properly rested, while accommodating his growing curiosity about the world beyond the fireplace. "You're a stubborn little thing," Jake observed one morning as he relocated the puppy back to his blankets for the 3rd time in an hour. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." The comparison stirred memories Jake typically kept locked away. Emma had possessed that same determined spirit, the same refusal to accept limitations that adults considered reasonable. She'd climbed trees, despite her mother's concerns, befriended every stray animal in 3 counties, and approached each day as if it held unlimited possibilities for discovery. As the puppy settled reluctantly in his nest, Jake found himself sharing memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Had a little girl once," he said, his voice taking on the careful tone men used when handling fragile things. "About your size, come to think of it, though she moved a lot faster, always getting into something she shouldn't, always sorry afterward, but never sorry enough to stop doing it." The puppy's brown eyes fixed on Jake's face with the intense attention small creatures gave to voices that held sadness. His small tail attempted an encouraging wag, as if offering comfort he sensed was needed. That evening, after completing his usual chores, Jake retrieved something he hadn't touched in over 2 years. The worn leather journal had belonged to Sarah, a wedding gift from her mother that she'd used to record everything from household expenses to her thoughts about their life together. After her death, Jake had begun writing in it himself, though his entries were sparse and painful. He settled beside the puppy's nest and opened the journal to a page near the beginning. Sarah's careful handwriting filled the margins with sketches, wildflowers from their first spring together, the outline of their house when it was barely more than a foundation, Jake's profile as he worked in their garden. "Your mama was an artist," he said softly, showing the puppy a drawing of Emma as a toddler, all round cheeks and wide eyes. Never had proper training, but she could capture the spirit of things. Said it wasn't about making pictures look real. It was about making them feel real. The puppy stretched his neck to sniff at the page, his wet nose leaving a small mark on the paper that Jake found himself unwilling to wipe away. As nights passed, these sessions became routine. Jake would read excerpts from Sarah's entries, sharing stories about their courtship, their struggles to establish their first ranch, Emma's birth, and early years. The puppy listened with the perfect attention of someone incapable of judgment, offering only the comfort of companionship without demands for emotional recovery. She was walking by 10 months, Jake read from an entry dated 6 years ago. Not content to crawl like other babies, had to be upright, had to see everything from the same level as the adults. Sarah worried she was trying to grow up too fast. The irony of that concern now felt sharp enough to draw blood. Emma had run out of time entirely, her growing up cut short by fever and the limitations of frontier medicine. The speed of her early development had been a gift, not a problem, though Jake had only learned to see it that way, after losing the chance to witness any more of it. By the 3rd week, the puppy's personality had emerged fully. He was curious, affectionate, and possessed of an intelligence that showed in the way he watched Jake's routines and anticipated his movements. When Jake prepared the morning medicine, the puppy would position himself expectantly for the dose. When evening approached, he would make his way to the spot beside Jake's chair where story time occurred. "You need a name," Jake said one evening, as the puppy demonstrated his improving mobility by successfully navigating from his nest to the kitchen door. "Can't keep calling you little fellow forever." The naming proved more difficult than expected. Traditional dog names felt inadequate for an animal who had shown such remarkable determination to survive. Jake considered and rejected dozens of possibilities before settling on something that felt appropriate. "Spirit," he said, testing the word aloud. "That's what you've got more of than anything else. Spirit enough to keep fighting when you were trapped. Spirit enough to trust a stranger. Spirit enough to heal." The puppy's tail wagged enthusiastically at the sound of his new name, as if understanding the significance of the moment. But with attachment came the return of familiar fears. Jake's dreams, peaceful during the early days of caring for the injured animal, began featuring variations of loss that left him waking in cold sweats. He would dream of finding Spirit motionless in his nest, or watch helplessly as fever claimed another small life, despite his desperate efforts. The worst nightmare came near the end of the 3rd week. In the dream, Jake was back in his previous town, holding Emma as the fever consumed her small body. But when he looked down, it was Spirit in his arms, those same brown eyes growing dim, despite Jake's pleas for God to take him instead. He woke to find Spirit whimpering softly from his nest, not from pain, but from some instinctive awareness of Jake's distress. The puppy's small body was pressed against the edge of his blankets, stretching toward Jake as if offering comfort. "I'm all right," Jake whispered, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Just old dreams that won't stay. Buried. The incident forced Jake to confront what he'd been avoiding since the day he'd found Spirit beneath the wagon debris. He was becoming attached to this small life in ways that made him vulnerable to the kind of devastating loss he'd sworn never to risk again. Every day of Spirit's recovery increased the stakes of their relationship. During his next visit to Doc Henderson for supplies, Jake voiced his concerns in the indirect way men discussed emotional matters. "How do you know when an animal's truly out of danger?" he asked, accepting a new bottle of willow bark extract. Doc studied him with the perceptive gaze of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines of what people were willing to say directly. "Physically, your pup's doing fine," Doc said carefully, "but I suspect you're asking a different question. How do you know when it's safe to let yourself care without worrying about losing what you've found?" Jake nodded, grateful that Doc understood, without requiring him to spell out his fears. "The honest answer is, you don't," Doc continued. "Every attachment carries risk. But the alternative is living like you've been dead already, and that's not much of a life for a man who's got years left to spend." That night, Jake sat beside Spirit's nest with the leather journal open in his lap, reading Sarah's words about the courage required for loving something you might lose. "Love isn't brave because it conquers fear," she had written. "It's brave because it chooses hope despite fear, again and again, every single day." Spirit stretched up to rest his small paws against Jake's leg, offering the silent companionship that had become their evening ritual. Jake stroked the soft fur behind the puppy's ears and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. He would see this through wherever it led, even if it meant risking his heart again. By the 4th week of Spirit's recovery, the splint came off to reveal a leg that had healed straight and strong. Doc Henderson pronounced the puppy fit for normal activity, though he cautioned against immediately demanding too much from muscles that had been inactive during the healing process. "Start with short walks," Doc advised as Spirit explored the examining room with newfound freedom. "Let him build his strength gradually. That leg may always be slightly stiff in cold weather, but it shouldn't limit him significantly." Jake watched Spirit investigate every corner of Doc's office with the thorough attention of someone making up for weeks of restricted exploration. The puppy's movements showed only the slightest favor of the previously injured leg, and his energy seemed boundless. The walk back to the ranch became Spirit's first real adventure in the wider world. Every scent, sound, and sight demanded investigation. Jake found himself stopping frequently to allow the puppy to examine fascinating discoveries. A fallen log, a cluster of wildflowers, the tracks of some small animal that had passed this way recently. "World's a lot bigger than one room by a fireplace, isn't it?" Jake observed, as Spirit's tail wagged furiously at the discovery of a butterfly resting on a rock. Back at the ranch, Spirit's curiosity quickly focused on Jake's daily routines. The puppy followed his human companion everywhere, learning the rhythms of ranch life with the eager attention of someone determined to understand his place in this new world. When Jake fed the cattle, Spirit watched from a respectful distance, his head tilted as he absorbed the interactions between Jake and the large animals. The breakthrough came during Jake's 3rd day of normal ranch work since Spirit's recovery. While moving cattle from the upper pasture to fresh grazing near the creek, Jake noticed one of his younger steers had wandered toward the property boundary instead of following the herd. Before Jake could redirect his horse to retrieve the wayward animal, Spirit had positioned himself between the steer and the fence line, using subtle movements to encourage the animal back toward the group. "Well, I'll be," Jake muttered, watching Spirit work with instincts that seemed to emerge fully formed. The puppy's approach was gentle but persistent, never aggressive, but clearly determined to keep the herd together. Within days, Spirit had established himself as Jake's unofficial partner in cattle management. The puppy seemed to understand the goal of moving animals from one location to another and anticipated Jake's intentions with remarkable accuracy. When Jake mounted Sage to check the eastern boundary, Spirit would trot alongside, watching for cattle that might need redirecting. "You're a natural," Jake told the puppy one afternoon, as they rested in the shade after successfully moving the entire herd to fresh pasture. Spirit's tongue lolled happily from his mouth, and his eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of work well done. The partnership transformed Jake's daily routines from solitary tasks into collaborative efforts. Having Spirit's help made the work easier, but more importantly, it made the work feel purposeful in ways Jake had forgotten. The puppy's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Jake of why he'd chosen ranching in the first place. The satisfaction of caring for living things, of building something meaningful with his hands and heart. This growing sense of purpose made Sheriff Tom Williams' visit all the more unsettling. Jake was repairing a section of corral fence when Tom rode up on his bay gelding, his usual easy demeanor replaced by the careful alertness that marked serious business. Spirit positioned himself between Jake and the newcomer until Jake's welcoming gesture indicated the visitor was friendly. "Afternoon, Jake," Tom said, dismounting with the deliberate movements of a man carrying uncomfortable news. "Got a few minutes to talk?" They settled on Jake's front porch with coffee, while Spirit explored the sheriff's horse with polite curiosity. Tom's weathered face showed the kind of worry that came from years of experience with human nature at its worst. "I've been having trouble with cattle rustlers east of here," Tom began, his tone careful but direct. "Lost maybe 60 head in the past month from 3 different ranches. Professional operation. They know what they're doing and when to do it." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. How close to here? Peterson Place lost 15 head 2 nights ago. That's maybe 8 miles from your boundary line. Tom sipped his coffee and studied the landscape visible from the porch. Your spread's isolated enough to be attractive, but small enough that they might figure you won't put up much fight. The implications hung between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Jake's modest herd represented everything he owned of value. Losing his cattle would mean losing the ranch, losing his independence, losing the life he'd built from the ashes of his previous existence. "What do you recommend?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Stay alert. Keep your cattle closer to the house if possible, and consider that you might not want to face professional thieves alone if they do come calling." That evening, as Jake performed his usual chores under the growing shadow of potential threat, he noticed how Spirit's presence had changed his perspective on everything around them. The puppy's alert ears and quick movements provided an extra set of senses for detecting unusual sounds or movements. More than that, Spirit represented something worth protecting beyond mere financial security. The realization sent Jake to a place he hadn't visited in over a year, the small trunk in his bedroom where he kept Sarah's personal belongings. Buried beneath carefully folded dresses and dried flower petals from their wedding bouquet, his fingers found the familiar weight of her silver locket. The piece of jewelry felt warm in his palm, its surface worn smooth by years of Sarah wearing it close to her heart. Jake had given it to her for their first wedding anniversary, and she'd treasured it beyond its modest value. Inside, protected behind glass, so thin it seemed like captured breath, were 2 tiny photographs, one of Jake from their courtship. Days, the other of Emma as a baby. He sat on the edge of his bed with the locket open in his palm, studying faces that belonged to a different version of himself. The man in the photograph looked young and confident, unmarked by loss, secure in the belief that love could conquer any obstacle. The baby Emma gazed back at him with the serene trust of someone who had never encountered anything but safety and affection. Spirit padded into the bedroom and settled at Jake's feet, somehow sensing that this was a moment requiring respectful quiet. The puppy's presence felt like a bridge between Jake's past and present, a living reminder that caring for something small and vulnerable didn't have to end in loss. She wore this every day until she got too weak to fasten the clasp. Jake said softly, showing Spirit the locket, though the puppy couldn't understand its significance. Said it kept us close to her heart, even when we were apart. The threat of cattle rustlers had awakened something protective in Jake that went beyond financial concerns. He had something worth defending again, not just the ranch, but the life he was building here with Spirit. The puppy had reminded him what it felt like to be responsible for something precious, to have a reason to get up each morning beyond mere survival. As he prepared for sleep that night, Jake fastened the locket around his own neck for the first time. The silver felt cool against his skin, but it warmed quickly from his body heat. Sarah's presence seemed to whisper through the small piece of jewelry, reminding him that love was always worth the risk of loss, that the courage to care was what separated living from simply existing. Spirit curled up on his blanket beside Jake's bed, and both of them slept with the heightened awareness of those who had something important to protect. Spring gave way to early summer, and Spirit's integration into ranch life became so complete that Jake could hardly remember how he'd managed the work alone. The puppy, now approaching his full size, though still compact and agile, had developed an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that made him invaluable during the daily routines of ranch management. When Jake needed to separate a single animal from the herd for medical treatment or examination, Spirit would position himself precisely where the other cattle might interfere, his presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. The larger animals seemed to accept his role without question, responding to his subtle movements and positioning as if he were simply another natural part of their environment. You've got better instincts than some cowboys I've known," Jake told Spirit one morning as they successfully moved the entire herd to a section of pasture that would provide better grazing. The puppy's tail wagged at the praise, but his attention remained focused on the cattle, alert for any animal that might decide to wander from the group. The partnership had grown beyond mere utility into something approaching telepathy. Jake would begin moving toward a particular section of fence, and Spirit would already be heading to the position where he'd be most helpful. When weather threatened and the cattle needed to be moved to shelter, Spirit would begin gathering stragglers before Jake had finished saddling Sage. This efficiency allowed Jake more time for property maintenance and improvements that had been neglected during his years of emotional isolation. He repaired fence lines, cleaned debris from water sources, and even began planning additions to his modest house that would make it more comfortable during harsh winter weather. The changes in Jake's daily routine hadn't gone unnoticed in town. During his weekly supply runs to Millfield, various townspeople commented on his improved demeanor and increased energy. Martha Colson proved particularly observant during one of his visits to purchase eggs and milk. "Haven't seen you looking this settled in years," she observed, as Jake counted out payment for his supplies. "That little dog of yours seems to agree with ranch life." Spirit, who had accompanied Jake on this trip, was investigating the area behind the saloon where Martha kept her chickens. His tail wagged enthusiastically as he discovered the fascinating scents and sounds of barnyard life, though he maintained a respectful distance from the birds themselves. "He's been helpful with the cattle work," Jake acknowledged, watching Spirit's careful exploration with the pride of someone whose companion was making a good impression. "I expect he has been," Martha said, her tone carrying the gentle wisdom of someone who understood more than was being said directly. "Animals have a way of bringing out the best in folks, especially folks who've forgotten what their best looks like." Her comment stayed with Jake during the ride home, primarily because it felt accurate in ways that both comforted and unsettled him. Spirit had indeed brought out aspects of his personality that had been dormant since Sarah and Emma's deaths: patience, gentleness, the capacity for joy in small daily victories. That evening, while organizing supplies in his bedroom, Jake discovered something that brought these changes into sharp focus. Tucked beneath Sarah's dresses in the trunk where he'd found her locket was a small, tattered book he'd forgotten existed. Emma's favorite storybook about a brave dog who saved his family from danger. The book's pages were worn soft from countless readings, and Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened to the first page. Emma had loved this story beyond all reason, insisting on hearing it read aloud nearly every evening, despite knowing every word by heart. Sarah had teased that their daughter was more interested in the pictures than the words, but Jake had suspected. Emma loved the story because it featured a dog who was both ordinary and heroic, small but mighty when courage was required. Spirit padded into the bedroom and settled at Jake's feet, drawn by some instinct that suggested his presence might be welcomed. The puppy's brown eyes fixed on the book with curious attention, as if understanding that this object held significance beyond its apparent simplicity. "Want to hear a story?" Jake asked softly, surprised by his own offer. He hadn't read aloud. To anyone since Emma's death, hadn't been able to bear the memories that such an act would stir. But something about Spirit's attentive presence made the prospect feel manageable rather than painful. Jake settled cross-legged on the floor with the book open in his lap, Spirit curling up beside him in a position that allowed the puppy to see the pictures. "Once upon a time," Jake began, his voice rusty with disuse, but growing stronger with each word, "there lived a small dog named Courage, who belonged to a family that loved him very much." The familiar words flowed more easily than expected, and Jake found himself adopting different voices for the various characters, just as he'd done for Emma years ago. Spirit's tail tapped gently against the floor, either responding to Jake's animated reading or simply enjoying the sound of his voice. As the story progressed through adventures and challenges that Courage faced while protecting his family, Jake began to see parallels he'd never noticed during Emma's bedtime readings. The fictional dog's determination to defend those he loved, regardless of his small size, echoed Spirit's own courage during his injury and recovery. Courage knew he was smaller than the danger that threatened his family, Jake read from a passage near the story's climax. But he also knew that love made him stronger than fear, and that protecting what mattered was worth any risk. Spirit's head tilted at the word courage, and Jake wondered if the puppy somehow understood that the story was about more than just entertainment. When Jake finished the final page, Spirit stretched up to rest his paws on Jake's knee, offering the kind of wordless comfort that had become their special form of communication. But their peaceful evening was interrupted by sounds from outside that sent both of them instantly alert. Horses approaching at speed, multiple riders, and the kind of deliberate noise that suggested people who didn't care about being heard. Jake extinguished the oil lamp and moved carefully to the window, Spirit following with the silent precision of someone who understood they might be facing danger. Through the darkness, Jake could make out the shapes of at least 4 riders near his cattle pasture, their movements systematic and purposeful. Cattle rustlers, just as Sheriff Williams had warned. Spirit growled low in his throat, a sound Jake had never heard from the puppy before. It was the growl of an animal prepared to defend his territory and his family, regardless of the odds he faced. Jake's hand moved instinctively to Sarah's locket at his throat, drawing strength from the reminder of everything he'd loved and lost. But this time, he wouldn't be powerless to protect what mattered. This time, he had Spirit beside him, and together they represented something worth fighting for. The cattle rustlers had chosen the wrong ranch to target. They were about to discover that some men, when backed into corners with everything they cared about at stake, became more dangerous than they'd ever imagined possible, and some small dogs, when protecting their families, possessed courage that far exceeded their size. Jake moved swiftly to his bedroom and retrieved the rifle he kept loaded beneath his bed, a weapon he hadn't touched in 3 years, but had maintained with the automatic precision of a man whose survival had once depended on such preparations. Spirit stayed close to his side, every muscle tense with alertness. Through the window, Jake could see the rustlers working with practiced efficiency. They'd brought extra horses and were systematically cutting his cattle from the herd, working in pairs to control the animals, while others prepared to drive them toward the main road. Professional thieves, just as Sheriff Williams had warned. Jake counted 5 men, all armed, all moving with the coordination that suggested extensive experience in this particular form of theft. Under normal circumstances, 1 man with a rifle might discourage such a group through superior position and the element of surprise. But something about their confidence suggested they weren't concerned about resistance from a single rancher. That confidence proved justified when the apparent leader of the group called out across the darkness in a voice that froze Jake's blood. Jake. "Morrison, I know you're in there, boy. Come on out and let's have ourselves a conversation about old times." The voice belonged to Blackjack Murphy, a name Jake hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 6 years, but had never forgotten. Murphy had been the leader of a gang that terrorized small towns across 3 territories, until Jake's badge and testimony had sent him to prison for armed robbery and murder. The man should still be serving his sentence unless... Don't be shy. "Now, Jake," Murphy's voice carried the mocking tone that had characterized him during his trial. "I served my time, got myself released early for good behavior. Been looking forward to this reunion ever since." Jake's mind raced through possibilities and calculations. Murphy's presence meant this wasn't random cattle theft. It was personal revenge, dressed up as criminal enterprise. The other men would be Murphy's new gang, probably recruited specifically for this operation. They would be prepared for resistance and motivated by more than simple profit. Spirit's low growl indicated the puppy's recognition of genuine threat. The small dog's protective instincts had activated fully, and Jake could see the same determination in Spirit's eyes that had sustained him through his injury and recovery. The puppy was prepared to defend their home regardless of the odds. "Stay inside," Jake whispered to Spirit, though he suspected the command would be ignored if circumstances turned dangerous. Jake stepped onto his front porch with the rifle held casually but ready, presenting the appearance of a man willing to negotiate rather than fight. The moonlight revealed Murphy more clearly, older now, scarred by prison life, but still carrying himself with the arrogant confidence that had made him dangerous years ago. "Blackjack," Jake acknowledged, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Didn't expect to see you again." "Oh, I made sure our paths would cross again," Murphy replied, his horse dancing sideways as he controlled it with casual expertise. "Took me some time to track you down after they let me out. Jake Morrison, former deputy marshal turned rancher, living quiet, keeping to yourself, probably thinking your past was buried and forgotten." The other gang members had positioned themselves strategically around the ranch yard, controlling the approaches while maintaining clear fields of fire. Jake recognized the tactics of men who had planned this confrontation carefully. "Prison gave me lots of time to think about our last meeting," Murphy continued conversationally, "about how your testimony put me away for 10 years, about how you cost me everything I'd built. Seemed only fair that I should return the favor. Your choices put you in prison," Jake said, though he knew rational discussion was unlikely to change the trajectory of this confrontation. "I just told the truth about what I witnessed." Murphy's laughter held no humor. "The truth, right. The truth is that you took away 10 years of my life, and now I'm taking away everything that matters in yours. Your cattle, your land, your..." Murphy's words were interrupted by Spirit bursting through the partially open front door, his protective instincts overriding Jake's command to stay inside. The puppy positioned himself between Jake and Murphy's horse, growling with the fierce determination of someone defending his family. "Well, look at that," Murphy said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "The tough lawman's got himself a pet. How touching." Before Jake could react, one of Murphy's men urged his horse forward, apparently intending to scatter Spirit away from the confrontation. But the puppy stood his ground, snapping at the horse's legs with the same courage that had sustained him through injury and recovery. The horse reared in surprise, and its rider, caught off guard by resistance from such a small opponent, lost his balance and fell heavily to the ground. His rifle discharged as he hit the earth, the bullet going wild, but the sound echoing across the valley like thunder. In the chaos that followed, Spirit darted toward the fallen man, either to press his advantage or to protect Jake from potential retaliation. But the rustler, humiliated by being unseated by a small dog, lashed out with his boot as Spirit approached. The kick caught Spirit in the ribs, sending the puppy tumbling across the hard-packed earth with a sharp cry of pain that cut through Jake's chest like a blade. Spirit struggled to regain his feet, clearly injured, but still attempting to position himself between Jake and the perceived threat. Something cold and deadly settled over Jake's thoughts as he watched Spirit's pain. The protective fury that had once made him an effective lawman, a quality he'd thought buried with his badge, surged back to full strength. "That was a mistake," Jake said quietly, his rifle shifting to cover the man who had kicked Spirit. Murphy's expression shifted from mocking confidence to alert wariness. He'd apparently recognized the change in Jake's demeanor, the transformation from defensive rancher to dangerous adversary. "Easy there, Jake," Murphy said, though his hand moved closer to his own weapon. "We're just here for conversation and some cattle. No need for things to get complicated." "You made things complicated the moment you hurt my dog," Jake replied, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. Jake's military and law enforcement training reasserted itself with startling clarity. He catalogued the positions of all 5 men, identified cover options, calculated angles of fire and escape routes. The skills hadn't disappeared during his years of peaceful ranching. They'd simply been waiting for circumstances that required their use. "See, that's your problem, Jake," Murphy continued, apparently hoping to regain control of the situation through conversation. "You get attached to things. Makes you predictable, makes you vulnerable." From the corner of his eye, Jake could see Spirit attempting to stand despite his injury, the puppy's determination undiminished by pain. The sight strengthened Jake's resolve while simultaneously highlighting everything he stood to lose. "Here's what's going to happen," Murphy announced, his confidence returning as he counted his numerical advantage. "We're taking your cattle, and we're burning your buildings. Consider it payment for those 10 years you cost me. You can ride away alive, or you can try to stop us and end up buried next to that dog of yours." Jake's finger moved to his rifle's trigger as he considered options and consequences. 5 armed men against 1 represented overwhelming odds under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Jake was discovering that he was no longer the same man who had spent 3 years avoiding conflict and emotional attachment. Spirit represented everything Jake had rediscovered about hope, courage, and the worth of fighting for what mattered. Watching the small dog's determination to protect their home, despite injury, had reminded Jake of who he'd been before grief transformed him into someone afraid to care about anything. "Counter-offer," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down dangerous men before. "You ride out of here right now and I don't kill all of you." Murphy's laughter was genuine this time, though it held edges that suggested violence was imminent. 1 against 5, Jake. Even for a former lawman, those aren't winning odds. Jake glanced down at Spirit, who had managed to stand and was once again positioning himself protectively despite obvious pain. The puppy's courage in the face of impossible odds reminded Jake that some things were worth any risk. "Maybe not," Jake admitted, raising his rifle, "but I'm not the same man I was 3 years ago. And this isn't just about winning anymore." The first shot shattered the night air, and everything Jake had built during his years of peaceful isolation transformed into something that would be settled by courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the small creature who had taught him to love again. The gunshot had sent Murphy's men scrambling for cover, but Jake's warning shot into the air achieved its intended purpose without escalating to deadly force. For now, the rustlers regrouped near the tree line, clearly reassessing their approach to a target who had proven more dangerous than expected. "Next time I won't aim high," Jake called out across the darkness, his rifle trained on Murphy's position. "Take your men and ride out while you still can." Murphy's response came as a harsh laugh from behind a large oak tree. "This isn't over, Jake. We'll be back when you're not expecting us, and next time, that dog of yours might not be so lucky." The sound of horses departing gradually faded, but Jake maintained his defensive position until their hoofbeats disappeared, entirely into the night. Only then did he rush to Spirit's side, where the puppy lay breathing heavily, his small body trembling from pain and shock. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, his hands moving gently over Spirit's ribs to assess the damage. The puppy whimpered softly, but made no attempt to bite or pull away, trusting Jake completely even in his pain. "We're going to get you fixed up." By lamplight, Jake could see swelling along Spirit's left side, where the rustler's boot had connected. The puppy's breathing was labored but steady, suggesting possible bruised ribs rather than internal damage. Still, Doc Henderson's expertise was needed to ensure no serious harm had been done. Jake fashioned another makeshift sling from blankets and carefully lifted Spirit for the urgent ride to town. The puppy's weight seemed heavier this time, not from physical change, but from the crushing awareness of how close Jake had come to losing him. The mile markers to Millfield had never seemed to pass so slowly. Doc Henderson answered his door, still fully dressed despite the late hour, as if he'd been expecting emergency visitors. The old physician took one look at Jake's expression and Spirit's condition and immediately ushered them into his examining room. "Cattle rustlers," Jake explained, as Doc began his gentle examination of Spirit's injuries. One of them kicked him when he was defending the ranch. Doc's weathered hands moved with practiced skill, feeling for broken bones and internal damage. While speaking softly to keep spirit calm, the puppy remained remarkably still throughout the examination, though his brown eyes never left Jake's face. Bruised ribs, some swelling, but nothing appears to be broken, Doc announced after completing his assessment. He'll be sore for several days, and you'll need to keep him quiet to allow proper healing, but he should make a complete recovery. Relief flooded through Jake with such intensity that his hands began trembling. The thought of losing spirit so soon after rediscovering what it meant to love something again had been almost unbearable. "There's something else," Doc said, his tone shifting to the careful neutrality he used when delivering difficult news. "Tom Williams was here earlier looking for you. Word's gotten around town about Murphy being back in the territory. Seems several people remember the trial and your testimony." Jake accepted the implications without surprise. In small frontier communities, few secrets remain buried for long. His past as a lawman would become common knowledge, along with the reasons Murphy might want revenge. "How much trouble am I in?" Jake asked, settling spirit gently in a nest of blankets Doc had prepared. "Legally, none. You served your time as a deputy marshal with distinction, and Murphy's the one with the criminal record. But practically?" Doc shrugged, his expression troubled. "Murphy's got resources and motivation. He won't give up after one failed attempt." The ride back to the ranch gave Jake time to consider his options, none of which appeared particularly appealing. He could pack up and leave, abandoning everything he'd built to start over somewhere else. He could stay and fight, accepting the likelihood that Murphy would return with better planning and more men, or he could try to end the threat permanently. Before it escalated further, back at his ranch house, Jake settled spirit in the familiar nest by the fireplace before retrieving something he hadn't touched since the day he'd hung up his badge. From the bottom of his trunk, beneath papers and personal belongings, his fingers found the familiar weight of his deputy marshal's star. The badge felt heavier than he remembered, its surface still bearing the shine that came from years of careful polishing. Jake had carried this symbol of authority and responsibility through some of the most dangerous situations a lawman could face, and it had always reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. Pinning the badge to his shirt felt like putting on an identity he'd tried to abandon, but also like reclaiming skills and strengths he'd forgotten he possessed. Jake Morrison, the isolated rancher, had been unprepared for Murphy's threat. Jake Morrison, the deputy marshal, was a different proposition entirely. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of Sheriff Williams and 3 townsmen. From Millfield, they rode up to Jake's ranch with the purposeful bearing of men who had come to offer assistance rather than ask for it. "Heard about your trouble last night," Tom Williams said, without preamble as he dismounted. "Figured you might. Could use some help." The other men introduced themselves as Pete Hawkins from the general store, Bill Crawford, who ran the livery stable, and surprisingly, Martha Colson from the saloon. All armed, all serious, all apparently prepared to stand with Jake against Murphy's. "Revenge! This isn't your fight," Jake protested, though he was moved by their willingness to involve themselves in his dangerous situation. "Murphy threatened one of our own," Martha said simply. "That makes it our fight too. Besides, you think we want cattle rustlers operating freely in our territory. Today it's your herd. Tomorrow it could be anyone's." Pete Hawkins nodded agreement. Man who'd kick an injured dog wouldn't hesitate to hurt people neither. Time to put a stop to this before it gets worse. They spent the morning planning defensive strategies and contingencies, treating the ranch like a military position that needed to be protected. Bill Crawford's experience as a cavalry sergeant proved invaluable in positioning men and weapons for maximum effectiveness. "Murphy'll come back tonight or tomorrow," Tom predicted, studying the approaches to Jake's property. "He can't let last. Night's failure stand without losing face with his gang, but he'll be more careful this time, probably bring more men." As they prepared for the anticipated confrontation, Jake found himself remembering skills and tactics he hadn't used in years. The ability to think tactically, to anticipate enemy movements, to coordinate with other armed men in dangerous situations. These capabilities returned with startling clarity. Spirit, despite his injury, insisted on participating in the preparations. From his blanket nest, the puppy watched every movement with alert interest, his tail tapping approval when Jake demonstrated how he planned to use the ranch buildings for cover and defensive positions. "That dog's got more fight in him than some men I've known," Bill observed, noting Spirit's determined attention to their planning. "Reckon he'll be ready to help when the time comes, hurt or not." As afternoon faded toward evening, the defenders took their positions. Martha stationed herself in the barn loft with a rifle and clear views of all approaches. Pete and Bill positioned themselves behind the corral fence where they could control access to the main yard. Tom took the house's back room to prevent Murphy's men from surrounding the building. Jake remained in the front room with Spirit beside him, serving as the primary target that would draw Murphy's attention while his allies prepared to spring their trap. It was a dangerous position, but also the most crucial one for coordinating their defense. As darkness settled over the ranch, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since the day he'd found Spirit beneath the wagon debris. The isolated, grief-stricken man who had avoided human contact and emotional attachment no longer existed. In his place sat someone who had rediscovered the courage to fight for what mattered, supported by friends who were willing to risk their lives for his cause. Spirit's warm weight against Jake's leg provided steady comfort as they waited for Murphy's return. The puppy's breathing had improved throughout the day, though Jake could see he was still experiencing discomfort from his injuries. Yet Spirit's eyes held the same determined gleam that had sustained him through every challenge they'd faced. "Together. Ready for this?" Jake asked softly, stroking Spirit's head with gentle fingers. Spirit's tail thumped once against the floor in response, a sound that carried more certainty than words could have conveyed. They were ready, together, surrounded by allies who understood the importance of standing against men like Murphy. They were prepared for whatever the night might bring. The silver locket at Jake's throat caught the lamplight, reminding him that he was fighting not just for his present happiness, but to honor the memory of everyone he'd loved and lost. Sarah and Emma would have approved of this stand, would have understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Outside, the first sounds of approaching horses broke the night silence. Murphy had returned as predicted, but this time he would discover that Jake Morrison was no longer facing him alone. Dawn came with deceptive stillness, the kind of false calm that preceded violent storms. Jake had spent the night in restless vigilance, expecting Murphy's return under cover of darkness, but the rustler leader proved craftier than anticipated. He waited for first light, when tired defenders might let their guard down and when visibility would favor his superior numbers. The attack began with smoke. Murphy's men had approached from multiple directions, surrounding the ranch buildings. Before Jake or his allies detected their presence, the first sign of trouble came when Spirit's ears perked up and a low growl rumbled from his chest, alerting Jake to danger his human senses hadn't yet perceived. "They're here," Jake whispered to Spirit, his hand moving to his rifle as he peered through the window into the gray pre-dawn light. Flames erupted simultaneously from 3 locations around the property's perimeter. Murphy's gang had brought torches soaked in coal oil, creating walls of fire designed to panic the cattle and limit escape routes. The message was clear. This time, there would be no negotiation, no warning shots, no mercy. "Jake Morrison!" Murphy's voice cut through the crackling flames and the increasingly agitated sounds of frightened cattle. "Come on out and face what you've got coming. No more hiding behind badges or barns." Jake could see the tactical situation developing rapidly. Murphy had at least 8 men now, positioned to control every approach to the ranch house, while the fires created chaos and confusion. The rustlers intended to drive Jake's cattle away in the panic while eliminating him and anyone who stood with him. But Murphy had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd planned for fighting a broken-down former lawman, not the coordinated resistance of multiple experienced fighters working together. Tom Williams' voice carried from his position behind the house. "Southeast approach secure. I count 3 of them trying to flank around the creek." Martha's rifle spoke from the barn loft, her shot precise enough to send one of Murphy's men diving for cover behind a water trough. "Got the high ground covered." "Jake, they can't get close to the house from this side." The coordinated response clearly surprised Murphy's gang. Their leader had expected to face isolated resistance, not organized defense from multiple positions. Jake could see confusion spreading among the rustlers as their simple plan encountered unexpected complications. Spirit, despite his injured ribs, struggled to his feet with determined purpose. The puppy's protective instincts had activated fully, and no amount of physical discomfort was going to keep him from defending his family and territory. "Stay low, boy," Jake cautioned as he opened the front door carefully. "We're going to need your special skills for this." What happened next demonstrated the remarkable partnership that had developed between man and dog over the months of working together. While Jake's human allies engaged Murphy's men in gunfire, creating distraction and preventing organized assault, Jake and Spirit implemented a strategy that turned the rustlers' own tactics against them. The torches that were meant to create panic among Jake's cattle became tools for a different kind of chaos. Spirit, moving with the same instinctive understanding of herd behavior that had made him valuable in daily ranch work, began positioning himself to direct the frightened animals not toward the rustlers' intended gathering point, but directly toward Murphy's men. 30 head of panicked cattle, driven by flames and guided by Spirit's precise movements, became a stampede aimed at the positions where Murphy's gang had taken cover. The rustlers suddenly found themselves facing not just gunfire from multiple directions, but the immediate threat of being trampled by animals they had intended to steal. Jake followed Spirit's lead, using his rifle to create additional noise and confusion while staying mobile to avoid becoming a fixed target. His law enforcement training reasserted itself completely as he moved between positions, coordinated with his allies, and maintained tactical awareness of the developing situation. "Watch the north fence," he called to Bill Crawford. "There, trying to regroup behind the corral." But Spirit was already moving toward that position, his injured ribs forgotten in the excitement of protecting his territory. The puppy's presence among the cattle seemed to calm them enough for directed movement, while maintaining enough agitation to make them formidable obstacles for the rustlers. Murphy's frustrated voice rose above the chaos. "Kill that damn dog! He's ruining everything!" The direct threat against Spirit triggered something primal in Jake's response. This was no longer about property or past grievances. It was about protecting the small creature who had restored his capacity for love and hope. Jake's tactical thinking shifted from defensive to aggressively protective. "Over my dead body," Jake muttered, moving toward Murphy's last known position with the focused intensity of someone who had moved beyond fear into absolute determination. The flames from the torches began to die down, but their smoke created a haze that limited visibility for everyone involved. In this confusion, experience and coordination would determine the outcome, and Jake's side had advantages Murphy hadn't anticipated. The climax of their confrontation was approaching, and Jake felt ready to face whatever came next with Spirit. Beside him, and allies supporting them both. Through the dissipating smoke, Jake spotted Murphy moving toward the main corral, where several of the rustlers' horses were tied. The gang leader's plan was collapsing, his men scattered and demoralized by the coordinated resistance they'd encountered. Murphy appeared to be making his escape, but Jake couldn't let him disappear to plan another revenge attempt. "Murphy!" Jake called out, stepping into the open space between the house and corral. "This ends here and now!" Murphy turned slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Up close, Prison had clearly marked him, thinner than Jake remembered, with the kind of hardness that came from years of violence and resentment, but his eyes still held the same cruel intelligence that had made him dangerous before his incarceration. "Jake Morrison," Murphy said, his voice carrying mock admiration. "Got to admit you've improved since our last meeting. Prison was supposed to break me, but looks like it just made me more focused. Same can't be said for you. Seems like that little dog made you soft." Spirit appeared at Jake's side, moving carefully due to his injured ribs, but positioning himself protectively despite the obvious pain. The puppy's presence seemed to amuse Murphy, whose laugh held edges sharp enough to cut. Touching. The tough lawman and his pet, ready to face down big bad Blackjack Murphy. "Tell you what, Jake, I'll make this easy for both of us. Walk away now, take that mutt with you, and I'll consider our business settled. Stay, and you'll both end up buried in the same hole." Jake felt the familiar weight of his deputy marshal's badge against his chest, but more importantly, he felt Sarah's locket and the warmth of Spirit's loyalty beside him. These represented everything worth fighting. For love, hope, the courage to protect what mattered regardless of personal cost. "Counter-offer," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You surrender now, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial instead of frontier justice." Murphy's response was predictable, a fast draw that would have been impressive in any saloon or street corner across the territory. But Jake was no longer the grief-stricken man who had abandoned his badge 3 years ago. His own draw was faster, smoother, backed by muscle memory that hadn't forgotten the skills that had once kept him alive in dangerous situations. The two shots came so close together they almost sounded like one report echoing across the valley. Murphy's bullet went wide, his aim thrown off by Spirit's unexpected contribution to the confrontation. The small dog had darted forward at the crucial moment, not to attack Murphy directly, but to harass his horse, which reared and bumped into the rustler just as he fired. Jake's shot found its mark in Murphy's gun hand, the impact sending the outlaw's weapon spinning away to land in the dirt with its cylinder cracked and useless. Murphy clutched his wounded hand against his chest, his expression shifting from confidence to recognition of defeat. "It's over, Murphy," Jake said, keeping his rifle trained on the injured man. "Your gang's scattered, your plan failed, and this time there won't be any early release for good behavior." But Murphy wasn't finished. With his good hand, he reached for a knife at his belt, desperation driving him to continue fighting despite impossible odds. The blade caught morning sunlight as he raised it, intending to make one final attempt at revenge. Spirit, despite his injured ribs, moved with the same protective courage that had sustained him throughout their relationship. The puppy launched himself at Murphy's legs, not with enough force to cause serious damage, but with sufficient impact to disrupt the knife attack and send Murphy stumbling backward. The rustler landed hard against the corral fence, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping on the ground. The knife fell harmlessly beside him, its threat neutralized by the combined efforts of man and dog working in perfect coordination. Jake approached carefully, his rifle ready, but his expression showing something Murphy probably didn't expect. Not hatred or vengeance, but the kind of measured justice that characterized good lawmen. This was the difference between Jake Morrison, the grieving rancher, and Jake Morrison, the deputy marshal. He had learned to balance strength with compassion, to use force when necessary, but not allow it to corrupt his fundamental decency. "Tom," Jake called to Sheriff Williams, who was approaching from his position behind the house. "Need you to take Murphy into custody. I think we'll find outstanding warrants on him and his men." As Tom secured Murphy with handcuffs, the defeated outlaw looked up at Jake with something that might have been grudging respect. "You've changed, Morrison," Murphy said, his voice strained from pain and defeat. "Used to be colder, harder. That dog of yours really did make you soft." Jake knelt beside Spirit, who was breathing heavily from the exertion, but clearly proud of his contribution to their victory. The puppy's tail wagged weakly as Jake gently examined him for any additional injuries from his confrontation with Murphy. "Maybe," Jake replied to Murphy's comment, his hand stroking Spirit's fur with infinite gentleness, "but soft in the right ways. Soft enough to care about something again. Soft enough to have people willing to fight beside me instead of just for me." Murphy's broken gun lay in the dirt nearby, its damaged cylinder a symbol of defeated threats and conquered fears. Jake had faced down his past and emerged not as the bitter, isolated man who had tried to bury his grief in solitude, but as someone who had learned that love made him stronger, not weaker. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the smoke and revealing a ranch that had survived its trial by fire with its essential character intact. 3 weeks after Murphy's defeat, the last traces of smoke and conflict had been cleared from Jake's ranch. The burned areas had been replanted with grass seed, the damaged fence posts replaced with stronger timber, and the corral expanded to accommodate the additional horses Tom Williams had allowed Jake to claim as compensation for the trouble Murphy's gang had caused. Spirit's recovery had progressed remarkably well, though Doc Henderson continued to insist on weekly examinations to monitor the puppy's healing ribs. The little dog's energy had returned completely, along with an increased confidence that seemed to reflect his crucial role in defending their home. He moved through his daily routines with the swagger of someone who had proven himself in battle, and found the experience satisfying. "He's developed quite the reputation in town," Martha observed during one of Jake's supply runs to Millfield. "Folks are calling him the dog who helped bring down Blackjack Murphy. Bill Crawford's been telling that story to anyone who will listen, and it gets more dramatic every time." Jake watched Spirit investigate the alley behind Martha's saloon, noting how the puppy's movements showed no lingering effects from his injury. The small dog had adapted to his minor fame with the same practical acceptance he'd shown toward every other aspect of ranch life. "He did his part," Jake acknowledged, counting out payment for his purchases. "Probably saved my life when Murphy went for that knife." The truth was that Spirit had saved more than Jake's life during the confrontation with Murphy. He'd saved Jake's soul. The small dog's courage in protecting their home had reminded Jake of who he'd been before grief transformed him into someone afraid to care about anything or anyone. That afternoon, Jake saddled Sage for a journey he'd been contemplating since Murphy's capture. Spirit bounded alongside the horse as they rode toward the hills east of the ranch, where a small cemetery held the graves of frontier families who had tried to build lives in this harsh but beautiful country. Sarah and Emma's graves occupied a quiet spot beneath a grove of aspens, marked by simple wooden crosses that Jake had carved during the darkest days of his grief. He'd visited this place regularly during his first year of isolation, but gradually the trips had become too painful to bear. Today, for the first time in over 18 months, Jake felt strong enough to face the memories without being overwhelmed by loss. Spirit seemed to understand the solemnity of the location, settling quietly beside Jake as he knelt between the two graves. The puppy's presence provided comfort without intrusion, offering the kind of companionship that required no words or explanations. "Sarah, Emma," Jake began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I want you to meet Spirit. He's been helping me remember things I thought I'd lost forever, like how to hope, how to love something without being paralyzed by fear of losing it." The afternoon breeze stirred the aspen leaves overhead, creating the kind of gentle music Sarah had always said sounded like whispered prayers. Jake found himself sharing stories about his life with Spirit, describing their daily routines, the puppy's remarkable intelligence, and the way their partnership had transformed both ranch work and Jake's perspective on the future. "I know you'd love him," Jake said, placing fresh wildflowers on both graves. "He's got Emma's curiosity and your gentle spirit, but wrapped up in enough courage for someone 3 times his size." As they prepared to leave, Jake felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since Sarah and Emma's deaths. The grief would always be part of him, but it no longer defined his entire existence. Spirit had taught him that honoring the memory of those he'd lost didn't require closing his heart to new love and new possibilities. The ride home took them past the Peterson Ranch, where Jake noticed unusual activity in the front yard. Several wagons were parked near the house, and people were loading furniture and personal belongings with the systematic efficiency of a family preparing to relocate. Jake guided Sage toward the house, where he found Carl Peterson directing the packing operation with obvious reluctance. The older rancher had been among the victims of Murphy's cattle rustling, and the loss had apparently forced difficult decisions about his future. "Moving on?" Jake asked, though the answer was evident. From the scene around them, Peterson nodded, his weathered face showing the kind of defeat that came from losing too much too late in life. "Can't rebuild at my age. Lost too many cattle to Murphy's gang, and the mortgage holder won't extend my payments. Heading back to my brother's place in Kansas." "What about the children?" Jake inquired, noting two young faces peering from one of the wagons, siblings who appeared to be around 8 and 10 years old. Peterson's expression grew even more troubled. "That's the hardest part. Mary and I can't provide for them properly anymore, and my brother's got his own family to worry about. We're hoping to find someone in Kansas who might take them in, give them the kind of opportunities we can't manage." Jake found himself studying the two children with unexpected interest. The boy had the kind of serious expression that suggested premature responsibility, while the girl watched the adults with the wary intelligence of someone who understood more about their family's situation than anyone preferred. Spirit padded over to investigate the children, his tail wagging with the friendly curiosity he showed toward all young humans. The girl extended her hand cautiously, allowing the puppy to sniff her fingers before stroking his fur with gentle appreciation. "He's beautiful," she whispered to her brother. "Look how brave he seems." Jake felt something shift in his chest as he watched the interaction between Spirit and the children. The puppy's acceptance of them seemed immediate and complete, as if he recognized kindred spirits who needed protection and care. That evening, as Jake prepared supper in his kitchen, he found himself contemplating possibilities he hadn't considered in years. The ranch house felt larger than it had in recent memory, and Spirit seemed unusually restless, as if sensing that important changes might be approaching. From his pocket, Jake withdrew a small package he'd picked up during his last visit to town. A leather collar he'd commissioned from the harness maker, complete with a brass nameplate engraved with both their names, Spirit Morrison on one side, Jake Morrison on the other. The collar represented permanence, commitment, and the kind of family bond that transcended species. As he fastened the new collar around Spirit's neck, Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible during his years of grief-stricken isolation. "What do you think about some company around here?" he asked Spirit, who responded with enthusiastic tail wagging. "I have a feeling those Peterson children might need a home, and we've got room enough for a real family." Outside, the sun was setting over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Jake of Sarah's watercolor paintings. But instead of bringing sadness, the beauty filled him with anticipation for whatever tomorrow might bring. Spirit settled beside Jake's chair as evening deepened into night, both of them content in the knowledge that they had built something worth protecting and ready to expand their definition of family to include anyone else who needed the kind of love they'd learned to share. Some endings, Jake reflected, were really just beginnings waiting for the courage to embrace them.